Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the ICOI webinar. The title of this presentation is Perfecting Your Dental Photography, something that is near and dear to my heart. I'll be your host for approximately an hour. My name is Les Kalman, and I'm an assistant professor in restorative dentistry, as well as the academic lead for continuing dental education. And I come to you from Canada, specifically Western University within London, Ontario, Canada. So nestled between Toronto and Detroit. And for those of you that know me, hello. And for those of you that don't, please feel free to reach out. If you're on social media, you can reach out at Doc Desmo on Twitter and Instagram, or through old school email at ljkelman@icloud.com. Just a little bit about myself. I've been a general dentist for about 22 years, and I've been doing photography for about 35 years. So a little more experience in that field. And I've been able to be a photojournalist for about 10 years and had this strong passion for motorbikes. So if anyone is ever in the area and would like to join me on a nice fall ride, just like the video, please reach out and we can set that up. So hopefully I can bring some tips and tricks that I've learned throughout the years being in photography. And these are a few of my highlights in my career. The bottom left, I was on the start grid for a race. Bottom right, we get to see some very remarkable things, such as a career-ending crash for Ben Spies. On the top left is Valentino Rossi. So I was able to meet him. He's one of our probably most famous motorcycle racers. And on the bottom right, we have an opportunity to contribute back and auction off some of our art. That's Nikki Hayden holding up one of our pieces that went out for auction, and the money then went for charity. And may he rest in peace. He lost his life a few years ago. And you know, taking images of motorcycle racing is not easy. You go in all sorts of elements. They get up to 350 kilometers, but they're so rewarding when you get some nice images. So if anyone is interested in having more information about that, this is my most recent book that I've done. Please feel free to reach out. But let's flip the script and stay on track and talk about dentistry and photography, and more importantly, implantology. So when we're thinking about photography, why would we use photography? What benefits does it have? Well, I feel that images have a profound power of communication. So for instance, if we look at something like this, they really invoke emotion, or they tell a story. They can create a mood. And a picture is worth 1,000 words. We heard that cliche before. And how fitting for us in dentistry, when we have record keeping to do, we can really augment our records and documentation with photography to tell the story. But we have to remember one thing, and I'm sure everyone has seen this. This is from Reuters. We have to make sure that photography is used and presented accurately without misrepresentation. So let's take a little step back and talk about records. So photographs and photography, they fall within records. And as self-regulated professionals, we have the latitude to decide what records are required for predictable and successful treatment outcomes. So whether they're radiographs or photographs, or cone beam CT, we get to decide what we select to help that case. And records are critical to implant and clinical dentistry, as they provide so much. They provide communication. They give us information for diagnosis and treatment planning, and then we can present that to the patient, to lab, and it's legal. Okay, so when we talk about records, we look in our regulatory body here in Ontario, the RCDSO, specific to implant dentistry. We can see that clinicians must use the records as appropriate to keep cases predictable and successful. If we're going to be taking these records, we better have consent. So consent is an important part of taking pictures of our patients. And I find this is such a positive thing, especially in clinical dentistry. If you enlighten the patient as to what you're taking the images for, Perhaps it's a presentation or a publication, let them know. Sometimes they want a copy of it. And that helps build your practice because these patients will share this information with other patients and it helps build the practice. Okay, let's talk about our objectives. What would we like to try to achieve through this presentation? I'd like that everyone really has an understanding of equipment and they learn proper operation of that equipment. They understand some imaging techniques and then learn some application and workflows that really can be put to use in clinical dentistry tomorrow. So let's start with the first one, understanding equipment. So when we start thinking about a camera, okay, and I want to really drive that home as a camera, we want to think about things like a camera body. Does it have the proper megapixels, a proper size? Is it the proper tool for the job we need? It should have a lens that has macro photography capability. And we need some sort of external light. We've seen this with Zoom and people at home using LED lights. We need a way to illuminate our field. And then we need a way to capture and store those images. And I don't recommend clouding them due to privacy reasons. So we should utilize some sort of memory card when we're moving forward. So equipment requirements, when we're looking at putting all this together, we want something that's easy to use, that's simple, that gives you the proper image quality, that keeps the cost down, okay? Because really at the end of the day, what we might be finding out is even though this might be for some clinicians, this might not be for all clinicians, okay? Because this takes some time. This takes some time and skill. And so this might have to be delegated to our auxiliary, where the dental surgeon is doing surgery and the auxiliary is helping with the photography and they're augmenting kind of what we're doing, okay? So let's go through and talk about some things, okay? If we want to understand equipment, we have to understand terminology. So let's talk about something called image size. We've already used this already. So we've seen this before, megapixels, a megapixel body, and we see that with devices as well, whether it's an iPhone or a tablet. Megapixel, we're talking about 1 million pixels. And I think we can all appreciate that the greater the number of pixels, the higher the image resolution. And this is a factor in photography of many things. So the camera sensor, the processor, and the lens quality. This really stemmed from when we were taking pictures and then blowing the pictures up to put on our wall. And we noticed that, whoa, once you blow it up, it didn't look very good. So let's walk through and have a peek. So there's a very, very, very small image. And if we look at the specs, we kept this very tiny, 50 by 50. But if we blow it up, this is what it looks like, very pixelated. This is of no value to us whatsoever. So we can see that size does matter. Okay, so in this one, this has some value to it. And if we start looking now, our dimensions are 300 by 300. So we get an idea that the bigger the image size, the more value it has. Well, what about resolution? What are we talking about when we talk about resolution? It's talking about packing as many pixels as we can into that image, all right? Trying to make it high definition, you know, this with televisions. So DPI is definitely what we're talking about, and we're talking about pixels per inch. Higher the number, the clearer the image, bigger the file number. Okay, so let's have a peek at one. Here we have one we can start seeing the top of the screen is starting to get a little pixelated. And actually, this is the smallest possible category that we could save an image for. We'll call it 1. So we can see that when we're reducing that number, poor the image quality. If we move it up a little, we've now seen that we've kind of lost that pixelation and we brought it up significantly. So typically what happens is both of these things, size and resolution, go hand in hand. And this really denotes image quality. So have a peek at this one. This is a gigapixel camera on the Empire State Building. And it's just showing you the power of photography, how far you can zoom in and the resolution that you can have. So size and resolution, bigger the better, okay? So look at that opportunity to really zoom in, see what's going on, see one of the workers on the street. So this is an idea of where the technology is going. And I mentioned bigger is better for size, but we'll talk about that in a minute. There is a limit, okay? So look, you can see what one of the workers are doing. Quite remarkable. We've probably heard the word JPEG before. This is really just an acronym, and I've listed it there for you. I'm not going to read all the points on the slides, but I want to complement what's there. And essentially what we're talking about is a compressed file. So it doesn't have all the information that you need. It's compressed. And when we compress something, we lose some information. So there's got to be something on the contrast, and that's something that is raw. So a raw image is a terminology that's used, and each kind of camera manufacturer will have their own flavor of raw. But what we're doing here is we're basically talking about an unprocessed, uncompressed image. So you have all the information that you need there. That's fantastic. So you have what you shoot is what's there, so that when you go to post-process it or edit it after, it's there. But please appreciate that these are now big files, and we'll talk about the impact that that has. Now, many cameras have both options, JPEG and RAW. So when you're shooting, you can select both, and your camera will save both, which means you'll have two image files. You just have to be aware of that. I will say that RAW is not always viewable in all software modes for editing. So if you think of RAW, I want you to think of a Lamborghini, because if you bought a Lamborghini, a top of the line Lamborghini, you're buying because you want to go fast. You do not want this vehicle stuck in first gear. And that's when you're buying an expensive camera that has high megapixels. If you're shooting RAW, you are going to utilize it to this fullest extent. But if you're only shooting in JPEG, it's like driving a Lamborghini in first gear. It doesn't make a lot of sense, okay? So we've already been kind of dancing around the issue of sensors. So sensors in cameras come in two kind of formats, full frame versus cropped. So essentially what we're talking about here, cropped is just smaller. So you're not always going to capture everything that you see in that image, where a full frame does. So bear in mind that if you need to play around with your camera, and you need to make sure that what you're seeing is what is captured in the camera. Because if that's coming to intraoral photography and you're missing some components, this is a problem. Let's talk about something that's really important in dentistry, something called depth of field. So essentially what we're talking about is how much of an image is in focus, okay? Is it one focus point, which is really, looks very nice in Instagram if I'm in focus here and everything else is blurred? That's very shallow. But what if everything is in focus, hopefully similar with the camera? Then we're talking about something that's very deep and very wide. And sometimes we're looking to do that in dentistry. So there's a great example. We have a shallow depth of field. Only a little bit of that image is in focus. And then a great graphic representation here where we have a low aperture, and we'll get to that in a minute, on the far left, where only one structure is really in focus, the rest is blurred. And as we move to the right-hand side, we can see that everything is now in focus. So we're going to see how that plays into the equipment that we need and how we can adjust that when we're taking images. Let's go ahead and talk about some of our camera options. And the reason I'm doing the quote and unquote, a camera traditionally is really just like you see in a camera store. It's got a body and a lens with interchangeable lenses and accessories. But what has happened over time is that these smart devices have become so advanced and so well suited that we can consider these as cameras. So we'll put that into that category. So we're going to be talking about four things: devices, point and shoot, the DSLR, and the mirrorless. So when we're talking about a device camera, again, it's either an iPhone or an Android phone or a tablet, but you should have a dedicated device. Okay, if you're going to be going that avenue, you do not want to use your personal phone for patient images, because if there's an issue, a compromise in data, then that's a violation of privacy. So I recommend buying a dedicated phone if that's the route you're going to go. And these things are fantastic. They've really come a long way. Great image quality, a little bit limited in image size compared to other methods. Some of the newer models do have a RAW capability, so we can save that as we talked about. Limited macro ability, we'll talk about that in a minute as well, and a very high technological turnover. So, no one walks around an iPhone 4 anymore. So we have to be aware of that things move pretty fast in this space. And you can get all sorts of peripherals that you want for it. So whether it's a macro lens adapter or some sort of LED light, that's available. Okay, so that's that category. What about the point and shoots? This is the one that I feel is kind of all in one. Okay, so these are relatively expensive and they give you pretty good image quality. Typically, no RAW capability. Okay, they're usually saving in JPEGs, and they have limited ability to be interchangeable. Changing lens, changing lights, they're usually fixed. And that scares me a little because when things are fixed, if you need to modify it, you can't. So you have to be worried about risk of obsoleteness. Okay, they get dated fast. So let's look at a couple of examples. These are the ones that point and shoots, and away we go. And especially in the dental area, I've listed one here on the bottom left. These are very set up so they're simple and intuitive, but that means they don't have a lot of interchangeability. But please beware of the cost. Okay, that's still a significant investment in a piece of equipment. Now, the industry standard, this is the DSLR, okay? Single lens reflex digital. This is the one I would bring to my races. This is ideal. This has everything I need, very fast shutter speed, excellent image quality, image size, RAW if I need it, pretty well unlimited ability to shoot, but there are some drawbacks. The cost, it's expensive. It's complicated. These are small computers. So, if you're just turning it on to green and shooting it on auto, you don't need an $8,000 body. You don't. Okay, so it's a computer. It's customizable to how you want it to shoot. And it's heavy. That's the other thing. So if it's heavy, we have to store it. And again, if we're delegating to auxiliary, we have to make sure that we have a protocol on how we're storing them, how we're using them, making sure we don't damage them. So there's a little diagram to show you that the way the light goes through, that's kind of the way the design of these DSLRs were, is that the light has to be reflected off a mirror and it shoots out. And that's why the body is such a bigger camera. So this is an image of one that has a dual kind of LED flashes on the end. This is an image of one that I used in the past. So we have our body, we have our macro lens, and then we have a ring flash that goes on the end, okay? Now, bear in mind, there is a domino effect if you get into this space. So if you run out and grab a brand new camera that's a high megapixel, it may have a domino effect. So first you're looking at getting a camera. And this lens on here is not the one that you would use intraorally, so you'd have to get a new macro lens. And then we talked about an external light source, LED, light or flash. And then you're going to need some sort of memory card to capture those images. And how are you going to transfer those images onto your computer? You need some sort of memory card reader, because most computers don't come with them now. Now, I'm going to warn you that if you do go out and buy a very new camera that's high megapixel and you are shooting RAW, you'll find that after you shoot 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 images and you go to download them, you might need a new computer. You'll find that it just has a ridiculous time processing that volume of data, which means you just better be mindful of your investments, okay? So that's the DSLR space. If we're looking at investments, this is pretty reasonable. So you could probably do up a package for about $5,000, okay? That's a reasonable package that will get you what you need. Maybe less if you're going used, but be mindful just as a consumer. So the final category is something that we call the mirrorless DSLR. And this is actually one of my favorite categories, and it has everything you need, okay? It's kind of a hybrid between a DSLR and a smartphone, okay? We'll talk about that in a minute, but everything we talk about, so interchangeable lenses, RAW capability, unlimited attachments, simple and efficient so we can train our auxiliary if we wanted to do those things. So I really enjoy these. And what happens is you have a very compact camera, because if you look at the diagram on the lower right, we are not sending our light through that mirror. It's coming right out, hence the term mirrorless. So now we can have things very tiny, small. We like that. It takes up less space. It's not as heavy to hold. So the mirrorless DSLR, typically you're looking at a standard body and you can get a standard lens. It doesn't have to be a macro lens, because what we can do is we can complement that lens with some macro magnifying rings that fit on the end of our lens. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, but it has the opportunity to take that camera and turn it into a macro camera increasing the image by 1 to 10 times, okay? We have the opportunity to bring in external LED light or flash, and then any SD cards. Now, really the only drawback that I've found with these cameras is it has a mild shutter lag, which means if you see something, if you press the button, there's a millisecond difference, which doesn't make a big difference in dentistry, but it does in other things like motorsports if a motorcycle is going 350 kilometers an hour. There's another bonus that we can do. A lot of these manufacturers have really tailored these for macro photographers, so you can still get a standard body, but a lot of them have a dedicated macro lens that has a built-in LED light. This is a game changer for me. If I'm delegating a lot of this to students, they have been unfamiliar with photography, and this is a no-brainer. It's a point and shoot, and we get successful photos time and time again. And this is kind of what it looks like. So there's our body, just it's about the thickness of two smartphones. There's our lens with the LED light built in, and that illuminates our field. And basically everything is as close to manual as can be. So the really nice selling point of the mirrorless DSLR is it has a live screen on the back. So there's no little viewfinder to look through. You have a live screen, and there's not a real bit of lag. So you can do all your adjustments on the back of the camera, just like we do on our phones. And if you want to take a picture, you press on the screen what area you want in focus. The camera focuses that, and the picture is exposed. So it makes life really simple. So this is one of the ones we have hanging around, EOS M model. We can see the lens, it's just a standard lens. There's what the back looks like, okay? So you can still do old school where you press the shutter, that's fantastic. Or you can use the screen and use it like a smartphone. This would be the LED light and flash combined. You can pick which one it does, and you can also change the intensity of the light. And then those focusing rings, those magnifying rings I mentioned, that's on the left-hand side. There's all four of them stacked together. So you could put one on the end of your lens, you could put two, you can mix and match to the desired magnification that you want. And this has worked really well for us. So there's one of them screwed on the end of the lens, and then there's the complete unit with the light. So this is our kind of go-to package, okay? If you want further information or details about that, again, technology turns over, please feel free to reach out. If we were gonna do a comparison, we see the DSLR on the right-hand side, and we see the mirrorless on the left. You can see there's a dramatic difference in the size of the equipment, how things have really changed over time. Quality of images. Well, here's a retracted image of just a dentition. So I think it's quite reasonable. It gives us some nice tones. It really zooms in nicely. This is just a dentiform, so we're zooming in a little more just to have a look at that detail. And then we're going to zoom in right into a fractured extracted human tooth just to really show how close we can get and see those details. So really, out of those options, it's up to you. Which one would you like to buy for the desired needs you have? And you have to kind of weigh those things with cost and with time. What I mean by time is, how long does it take to learn how to take good images? How long does it take to delegate these? And then the last one is application. What are you going to use it for? Okay. Are you a travel photographer that wants the best camera, that just wants to write it off? So we say we use it in the office, but really think about what you're going to be using. Okay. Let's go over some practical tips that really I feel most photographers forget about, and maybe they just weren't conveyed. So the very first one that I wanted to talk about was a lens filter. We already introduced that idea with the magnifying filter that goes on the end. But the important part is the day you buy your new camera and lens, that the end of the lens is coated. You do not want to impact that coating. So you don't want to get a fingerprint or a smudge on it. You don't want to clean it with Windex, because that coating really affects your image quality. So first thing you should do, is go out and buy a lens filter. It's just a UV filter. It's not going to change the color of anything, but you're going to screw that on the end of the lens, and it's a protector, and it stays on. Okay, so please don't forget that small tip. We love to get close-up images in dentistry. If we really like to get close-up, another thing we can use is something called extension tubes or rings. So what this is just a little gasket or spacer that goes between your camera and your lens so that we can magnify that image a little more. Got to be careful though. If we're using these, we usually take away the autofocus feature. Okay, so bear that in mind. You have to go with manual focus. I find when people are taking pictures with patients, they forget about two things. Number one, a patient is nervous, and when we get nervous, we get the shakes. Here's the other thing. Some clinicians are nervous. You know, if we're getting in there, implant placement doesn't look so good, we're worried about where we are in the anatomy, we get a little shaky. That conveys with when we're taking images. So we have inherent shake in the patient and in the operator. So don't be afraid to utilize a tripod, okay? And that way it just stabilizes things and it takes away that variable. We don't have to worry about it. So let's move on to something where we can talk about proper operation. How do we use this camera? What are some of the variables that we can adjust? So taking images is really a balance. There's just, it's not one way to get there. It's like cooking. Okay, there's multiple ways to get to the end product. But essentially what we're trying to do is have a balance between three things: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Okay, and if we get an idea as to what these control and how we can change them, when our images don't turn out, then we can brainstorm to figure out what went wrong. Very simple to something like an old school prosthodontic impression. We can look at it and say, what went wrong? Okay. So if we're thinking about ISO, I want you to think about Will Ferrell here. He went into the tanning bed a little bit too long because he's very light sensitive. All right. So here we're talking about the light sensitivity of the sensor. And we have the ability to adjust that. This is variability. So the higher the value, the more light sensitive. But it also means your image is going to be more grainy, not as smooth, okay? So we want to try to keep that ISO as low as possible, but a happy range where we don't start seeing much of that grain is somewhere between 2 and 800. So that's a ballpark figure, okay? If you see Costanza squinting like this, he's limiting the amount of light coming in. I want you to think about aperture, okay? So in a lens, there's a diaphragm that we can change by adjusting it, and that changes the amount of light coming in. So lower the number, the larger the diaphragm, okay? This is a key cost for lenses, and this also has an impact on depth of field. So here's a little diagrammatic representation. We can see on the bottom, F is 2, that's the value, that's letting in the most light. F16 is closed off, that's restricting light coming in. So just be aware that we have different functions for the aperture. We talked about movement and shutter speed. Well, we can control the shutter speed in a camera, okay? So we can make it as fast as we want. 1/5000th of a second is how fast some of them are. And we can make it as slow as we want. We can make it 30 minutes long if we're kind of watching the rotation of the planet and getting some star trails in the sky. But in clinical dental photography, we want to kind of keep it at 1/60th, nothing lower than that, maybe a little bit higher if possible, because then we start getting some blur with either the patient or the operator. So essentially what we have is, again, a balance between ISO, shutter, and aperture. And if we look at this little diagram, it really draws this conclusion nicely. So let's start on the bottom, look at ISO. If we see at ISO 50, if we can put that ISO that low, it means we have enough light. So that's number one. But if we don't have enough light and we have to increase the light sensitivity, it's going to get grainier. So that's how that balance works. Let's go to shutter speed. We've talked about this. If you want to have no blur whatsoever, then you're going to do 1/1000th, the far end of the spectrum. So you're going to have a very fast shutter speed. But that also means that you must have enough ambient light to expose that image. Let's go to the top, and this is usually the most complicated, which is the aperture. So if we're looking at f32, this is a big number. This means we've closed that lens right off. We're not letting a lot of light in. That means it's got to be bright enough for our image to be exposed. And you can see how it affects your depth of field, okay? There you're gonna have a very wide depth of field. So just keep those in mind, and it doesn't come right away. It takes a little time for this to solidify, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And that's with the Canon Simulator. So I'm just using the Canon Simulator because I shoot Canon. I'm not endorsing them. I'm sure Nikon might have something out there as well. They're all fantastic. So I'm not endorsing Canon, but what I do like is this Canon Simulator. And what you can do is you can go online and you can start taking pictures by adjusting those variables. So if you have anything ready, just QR scan code with your smart device, take a picture. That's going to take you to the Canon Simulator, and I'll walk you through kind of what it does. Okay, so once you get online, this is kind of what the platform looks like, and we can see a couple of things. We can see that that's our little screen. That's where the image is going to be taken, and we take our picture where the blue camera is. And it's going to tell us if we have good or bad exposure. We can do that. You can pick between 3 different modes. I really like manual because then we can play with everything versus the priorities. So if we go back to manual, we can change whatever we want. The aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And on the right, it'll show you digital noise. So we can pick one. We picked 100. Let's move this all the way to f22. And then let's move that shutter speed down a little. And then you can see it's telling us good exposure. Let's take an image. And there it is. So we got the good exposure. We have a wide depth of field where everything is coming into focus. We have the invisible motion because we can see the propeller is moving, but we can't really see that fixed. So it will break that down for you. It will tell you how the image is looking. There's a lot more things to learn on this platform. They'll take pictures of your shots and tell you how they turned out. So this is something I really recommend all participants kind of go on. This is great for you. This is great for your auxiliary because it takes a little bit of a while to solidify those variables that we can adjust. What's my tip? What's my kind of take-home tip? Well, if we're doing intraoral dental photography, I always shoot on manual all the time. I'm going to try and set my ISO to about 400, and I'm going to try to keep my aperture at about f8. Okay, so this way I get enough light in, I get a pretty wide depth of field. For me, I'm happy with a shutter of 1/125th of a second. Okay, so this is pretty quick. So here's where I change things up a little. We haven't introduced this in the simulator, but I've always talked about an external light. So here's where I put my external light on, and this is the same light that we'll use if we're zooming and it's over here. I'm gonna adjust it just like a light would, brighter, less bright, and that way my camera has the ability to process that light. I'm not using it like a flash at all. I'm using it like a light. And then I'm gonna adjust my macro lens accordingly. So typically I don't go more than about a +4 filter size on the end of my lens, okay? And those have worked very well for the intraoral photos that we've taken. It's given us the information we need. It's provided the value we need. So those are my recommendations. For those of you that get really, really frustrated, if we're just stressed for time and the next patient's coming and you need these images, just turn it to the green auto. Your camera will pick the proper variables. It might not give you the depth of field. It might not give you the graininess, but at least you get something that's of value, okay? Well, let's be honest. Let's be clear. Most people are going to be shooting with a smartphone. So my smartphone tip, if we're going to be doing it, is download and use a manual camera operation app, okay? Unfortunately, I'm an iPhone guy. I don't have the latest. But it's pretty automatic. I can't change things, but you can download manual apps that work seamlessly, and now you can get into the mindset of shooting manually and changing your variables. And some of the best smartphone apps that I found for you are right here. They're there. You can scan the QR scan code and have a peek, and then pick the one that works best for you. But this does take some practice, okay? So moving on, let's talk about some imaging techniques. How do we get those shots? How do we set them up? How do we get the information we need? So the first one is, this is my youngest a few years ago, Max. He's holding a DSLR. You can see the size of this camera. It's absolutely massive. But with this kind of camera, you have to look through the viewfinder. You have to understand that when you look through the viewfinder that you're going to have focus points. And you have to tell the camera what focus point you want it to focus on. It doesn't know. It might go random and go everywhere you want. So you have to tell it where to go. You then have to put your finger down gently to release the button. Okay. So that's the workflow with the DSLR. We do have a live screen on the back. Absolutely. It doesn't work like a touchscreen, but there's live screen, but it's a lag. It's a lag. It doesn't work fast and it drains your battery. So these are all the important things that you want to be aware of when you're shooting clinically. So the LED light source that we talked about, I find that when we're using flashes, I find that unless you have your camera set up properly or something has been changed by accident, the flash can wash your image out. Too much flash, make it useless. Okay, so TTL is something called through the lens. You usually will read your manual, have everything set up. We won't talk about much beyond the scope of this, but what I'm saying is if you don't have it set up, you're going to get a lot of images like this. And this was the case for a summer research when we took hundreds and hundreds of images and none of them were used, and we're already done with this. So flashes tend to do that. So that's why I like the LED light source. So this can just fit on your shoehorn. Okay, it can mount onto the camera, but what we're talking about is a constant external light source that's variable. You can change it. So there's what it looks like from the front. This way your camera has the opportunity to register that and balance that with the image that it's registering, similar to a phone. And we can buy these to fit on you in the lens. So this one has both. It's the lens and flash combined. And I think we chatted about this before. You can pick a flash, you can pick a light. You can change the intensity to both. Works really nicely. And it keeps things really predictable. So moving on, using that, what are some tips for lab product images? So for me, the biggest thing is a black background. It really makes things pop. Okay, that black background absorbs a lot of that LED light or a flash and it just makes it look better. And you can get these materials anywhere. You don't have to go to a specific camera store to get them. You can get them at a hobby store. Okay, you can save money on that. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's an image taken of a dental form, just non-black background. It's busy. We lose it. So this was a very quick makeshift studio I did in my office because I needed an image of a 3D printed metal titanium bar. It works because with a little bit of editing and a little bit of cropping, we can end up something like this that is now publication ready. And be aware, as you move out there, you can buy these pop-up little studios. I have 2 or 3 of them. They work great. You can pick the different backdrops and they make life simple. So $100, something like that, nice and simple, keeps everything together. And so we can get, nice images of a master cast showing the position of that implant that was placed, see how everything is healing. We can get nice images of these are 3D printed dentures that we're going to be trying in. This will be our try-in instead of using wax rims, but it just really draws our attention right to that product. So if we're talking about taking lab or product images, sometimes we see that really cool mirror, that mirror reflective surface. How do we do that? So to do this, you would need that kind of a studio setup. Okay, because what you want to do is you want to have black going behind our mirror. So we're going to be putting our mirror down, we're going to be putting our product, and now we're going to be focusing down onto the product, but we're focusing on the product and not the reflection. So here you want to use everything we talked about with the proper variables. You want to use your tripod so that everything doesn't move, and you want to zone into it, but you're into that area. So this is a great example. This is an instrument that we developed a few years ago in research, and it just gives it that really neat reflective look. This is a temporary abutment. I'm sure everyone is aware of its peak, but you can see it just gives it that really nice wow factor that I like. If we're going to be taking clinical images, turn that dental light off, okay? It's hot. It's got a different temperature. It can skew the images. It can throw your camera off. So we take all of our images with that off. We don't walk our patients to the window. We just take them in the chair, but we turn all the light off. And make sure if your office has obviously lights, just make sure they're color corrected so it doesn't throw things off too much. So just one tip. With our patients, we can do the same thing with black background, okay? You have to be a little creative. Maybe you can mount a black mat in a frame without the glass or non-reflective coating and have it on the wall, or you can drape some black cloth, okay? But what it does is it just really directs us, similar to the product, it directs us into the patient. So here would be a perfect example. So this is just a black backdrop behind the patient. This would be where we take pictures with our patients. We routinely take them over. This was in our office, not at the school. Again, with COVID, a little bit of restrictions. You can also have your assistant hold up the cloth just behind them, because really you're only looking for about a 12 by 12 space to direct that darkness. So retraction. Unfortunately, lips and tongues get in the way, and so does saliva, and this doesn't really make for a very good photo at all. So I'm sure that everyone is aware that there are so many devices out there that we can retract and take a picture of what we actually want to see for the communication that we want to do. So lots and lots of cheek retractors. Pick whichever one you want. Lots of retractors. They can come in clear, they can come in black. This is just a lip retractor. And this lip retractor is one. This is it in action. And here what we're doing is we're just holding up that top lip. I don't need an occlusal view here. I need a view of the mucogingival line showing the placement of this implant is extremely poor and will fail. You know, maybe diagnosis and treatment planning was a little askew, but this is the information that I'm trying to capture in this image, okay? For this image, this is a 12-year evaluation of a implant-supported milled bar, and we're just taking a photo of the amazing job the patient has done looking at the soft tissue. But here we're retracting everything out with the cheek retractors and mouth prop, open everything up so that we can get an image in. Working beautifully. And then in this particular case, again, we're using the lip retractor. Here we're having a closed bite view. Obviously, individual has fractured off his central incisor, but here we want the patient biting so we can really see that deep bite and that wear to help with our diagnosis, our communication, and our treatment planning. The occlusal views have always been a difficult one for everyone to do. And the important one to remember is we have some protocols we can do to make it easier. So you want to use a proper dental mirror. I know I just mentioned about black backdrops you can get from the craft store. You do not want to do that here. You want to go out and get the high-end dental mirrors. They have special finishes and coatings, and that's what you want. You want to heat these up. Your patient is warm. Okay, so if you don't heat these up, every time your patient exhales, it's going to fog up. So we actually like to use a defogger just to clean that off. Now, you're going to be really looking at a magnified image, so you have to make sure that these are clean, clean, clean. So if they're heated up and cleaned and defogged and use the paper towel or a cloth, just make sure there's no bits of cloth on that. Make sure there's no lint, because it's going to make it very difficult, and you're going to lose the value of your photograph. Now, the important part here is your patient is reclined and the mirror is put in, and you usually need the help of an auxiliary, and you're shooting in the reflected surface. That's the important part. Here's the mirrors we're talking about. Spend some money, get the ones you need, different dimensions for different applications. Just be aware what's there. And when we're taking those occlusal views, you're going to take a image of the reflected surface. Okay, so there's just a little image to show there, and I have a graphic to show it. So mirror, in this particular case, we're going to be taking an image of the maxillary occlusal plane. We have the patient reclined, we have them opened, we have the mirror resting against the mandibular surface, we have our camera coming overhead, and we're shooting in to the reflected surface of the mirror. And that's the image we're going to be getting, so just make sure it's focused. We can get things like this. Okay, so this is a maxillary arch, obviously a dentulous after we removed the teeth. I think this was the case that was fitted with those 3D printed dentures that you saw earlier. For those of you that were wondering where that position of the implant was, there's an occlusal view of that implant that was right at the mucogingival area. You can see that our Diagnosis and treatment planning has really compromised the case, and there's not a lot of hard or soft tissue, and the prognosis will be quite poor. But it's given us the information we need. And usually I'll start an image. I'll start a presentation with this image, and I'll just let it sit for 10 or 20 seconds and let everyone process it. And you can start hearing the emotion, like, oh, just the value, the power of photography and images. Here's another one, just to really show the heavy occlusal forces. We have a couple of implant-supported crowns where we're losing some of the porcelain. So, you know, what image are you taking? What value does it have? What are you trying to communicate? The one that's not used too often is the buccal or the quadrant views, if we're going to be going into the buccal corridor to see. So once again, we're going to be using a dental mirror. You really want to retract significantly, dry that area, and you're going to want to take a picture of the reflected surface. So you're shooting into the mirror, not the jaw, okay? So in this particular case, we see a transposed canine. We see a nice edentulous space. That's a great site for an implant-supported crown to help with that area. We have another view. This is our radiographic surgical stent combination that we published a few years ago. And it tells the story, it has value, it gives the image. I think the best one, I think that has the most impact are the anterior views, you know, when we're showing a patient smile. So in this particular case, I always recommend using the black backdrop, and this is called a contraster. These are the equipment out there that will do our job easier. So dry the area, retract out what you need, place the contraster, know your variables on the camera, expose your image, review it and see how it looks. This is the contraster. Again, multiple different manufacturers, multiple materials. Some of them are now malleable material that you can adjust, and you fit those intraorally where you want, and they're sterilizable. So in this particular case, we're going to be retracting the lip up and out of the way. We're going to be putting our contraster behind the maxillary centrals. We're going to bring our camera over. We're going to remember our variables. We're going to focus where we want, and then we're going to expose that image. And there you have a maxillary anterior view. So just a note on the required views. You know, again, this is within records, so we always use our professional judgment to capture the records that we feel are appropriate. But bear in mind that some credentialing platforms, some different platforms might have specific requirements. So know those before you start the case. Because if you've already started the case and you're into the provisional phase or you prep the tooth, you've lost your pre-op. You can't go back in time to get those. So really trying to know ahead of time what photos you should have. Make yourself a little chart, expose those images, take those images to make sure you have them. In the world of digital photography, now remember, I come to you from a time when we used to take film photography. That was a different era, but with digital photography, take as many images as you need. And that way you have them if you need them. So for that particular case where they poorly positioned implant, that was the smile line, and that really was our saving grace. So it's good to have those views in your back pocket. You know, with Instagram and everyone kind of showcasing things, we want to be very, very, very mindful in dentistry that these are records. So the editing that you're doing should be very limited. So do not misrepresent images, okay? We don't want to change the color of teeth. We don't want to take away from the value of that image. So I saw this just a little while ago on Twitter. It looks like it's a Photoshop way to brighten those teeth in 10 seconds. So I'm pleading to my fellow clinicians, let's not do this, okay? Let's show things true to life, okay? And just to add to that, if we're looking at adding images, sometimes we're asked to submit the raw image or the raw image data. So we talked about the raw image, and I don't have the time to go over this in this lecture, but there's a workflow for saving images. So you'll save your raw, and then you'll work and refine the edited one. You should always keep the original, because if you're going to be submitting something, sometimes they want to make sure that what they see is what they get. Okay, they want to make sure that we haven't taken away from the image. Okay, let's look at the final one, and that's learn applications and workflows. How can we put dental photography in your clinical practice today or tomorrow? So let's do full circle. Why use photography? I think we established it's a great form of communication. How can we communicate? What pathways can we use? First one is with patients. So we know we have a legal and ethical obligation. Okay, this is our job. We have to use the right records. But what about protecting ourselves? You know, documenting what came in before it was there, documenting through a procedure. What about taking images to help with the diagnosis and treatment plan, so that we can go back to the patient for case acceptance. So for instance, if we have a patient that walks in and we know that things are not looking good in that area, it's very difficult to express, but maybe they've just been used to that. Now we have a record in time of what things were like. Now we can communicate to the patient. Now we can get the ball rolling if treatment is required. What about the laboratory? You know, I always felt the laboratory to be such an important part for the clinicians. I would always reach out to the laboratory before I did a case and said, hey, look, I'm hoping to do this case. Can I get your thoughts on it? What do you think? And we would just work together as colleagues throughout the case. And it made life really easy. But in this particular situation, photography helps us to communicate with the lab, keeping things predictable and successful. Okay, minimizing clinical time. We want to bring the patient in and deliver and get out of there. That chair time is precious. So it helps us to get the end result. So in this particular case, if we're working on interior aesthetics, maybe we needed more information than just a retracted lip view. Maybe we needed the nose and the interpupillary line. Maybe we needed to see that. Maybe it gives the lab better perspective, more contextualization. So this is where photography really helps us out. And I mean, there's no better way than shade documentation. So whether we're prepping teeth before, during the prep for the stump shade, or after, whether we're verifying or comparing a patient's crown and telling the lab, here's the crown, here's what we need. So usually what I'll do in this case is I'll bring the shade up to it so they can see. So if I want to match something up to something that the patient had, this way the lab knows. Shades change, you know, different lighting, eye fatigue. We don't get it right all the time. So the more information we have, the better. And photography provides a lot of that information. And what if we want to refer off to our specialists? What if we want to give the best treatment to our patients? So this gives us an opportunity to document what's there, to communicate to the specialists so that they're seeing what we're seeing. Okay, so again, patient comes in, we see that we have a zirconia pink abutment to mask the poor diagnosis and treatment and rendered. We know that we're on the same page. So it's a great way to communicate. Another way that I felt it helped communication is with insurance companies. You know, if we're doing a predetermination, if we need a specific procedure done and they say no, and they need more information, well, sometimes it's fantastic to give them the information. In this case, we just digitized the radiograph, which we didn't talk about. But if we have a crown that is just not morphologically correct, the anatomy is gone, and we're looking to redo that, it gives the insurance company more information, visual information. Picture is worth 1,000 words. Publication and presentations. You know, as clinicians, I think it's important to show what we're doing, really get feedback from our colleagues, to show novel techniques, to really provide information on what we're doing. So in this particular case, we used some digital photography for implant site preservation. This was using a novel post and crown through CAD/CAM. This was back in 2013. But a great way to show what we're doing, some innovations, get feedback, presentations. We talked about publications. And if we are submitting manuscripts, we've already talked about some of the things about size and resolution. This is part and parcel to getting something published. They're going to want an image, a certain size with a certain resolution. You need to be aware of that if we're going to go down this workflow. Last but certainly not least is credentialing. Okay, if you would like to kind of do the voluntary credentialing and have your colleagues see the cases that you're doing, photography provides an amazing opportunity and is usually required. So it helps show the diagnosis and our treatment plan, what we're doing, the treatment. It shows the pre-op conditions. It shows the procedures that you've been doing, whether they're surgical, whether they're prosthodontic. What about post-op? What did it look like immediately 1 day post-op, 3 weeks post-op, 3 months, 1 year, 2 years, 12 years? This is the opportunity for you to showcase the work that you've done. And this is one of our pre and posts that we did many years ago. And if you look at the ICOI credentialing and we look at the different pathways that we have, the fellowship, the mastership, the diplomate, we can see that there's things in there that we have to be aware of. Okay, so for instance, if we go online and we look at the fellowship candidates, what are some of the requirements? I'm going to highlight those. We need clinical photographs of final cases are the basic requirements for case documentation. So we already mentioned this a little bit, that you want to take as many images as you can. You want to take those pre-ops, because if you've already went on to the procedure, you can't go back in time and take that pre-op. Take some procedural photos, showcase the amazing work that you're doing. Take some of the flap, take some of the implant placement, take some of the closure. Show everyone the work that you're doing. Show on post-op, how well the patient healed. These records, they're ethical, they're legal, for credentialing, they're important, and they're really showing others the work that you've done. So a history of what you've done. And I highly recommend going down these credentialing routes. They're a lot of fun. It really, it's you surround yourself with a lot of like-minded individuals. It really builds your portfolio, and it makes things fun. So on a closing note, this was recently taken about a month ago. I've taken into some kayaking. This was obviously a sunset paddle, and this is my Zen time. It's a very peaceful time for me, and just a little motivational line to go with it. I know we talked about photography and perfecting it, but please realize that getting to that perfected state takes some time. So try to continuously improve little by little by little, instead of just putting it off. Okay, if you can do that. So thank you so much for your time. I know we're all busy, and I'm sure that we have been inundated with webinars. Hopefully this gave you some new information, something you can take back right away. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We talked about socials. You can also reach out through email at ljkalman@icloud.com. And on the left-hand side is a QR scan code for my book chapter on 3D printing. And I don't receive any royalties at all, but it's for those of you that want to get into 3D printing and dentistry and implant dentistry. That's a piece of work I'm very proud of. And on the right-hand side is a QR scan code for my bio for the Western research. I'm always open to anyone reaching out for any collaborations as well. And there it is on the right-hand side. So this is to hopefully getting back to live presentations and meeting everyone and saying hello and sharing a drink and a handshake and sharing some thoughts and collaborative efforts. This is fun, but I'm really hoping that one day we can get back to a live interaction somehow. So thank you very much. Take care of yourself.